I never thought I would be the person in my family accused of being selfish. For most of my life, I was the one everyone called when something went wrong. If my mother needed help paying a bill, I handled it. If my father needed a ride to an appointment, I took him. When the roof started leaking, I was the one on the ladder while my younger brother, Daniel, was always too busy. So when my mother passed away and left the family house to me, I honestly thought there would be some sadness, maybe some disagreement, but eventually everyone would understand. I was wrong. My brother now says I stole his future. He says the house should belong to him. And last month, he told the entire family that if I don't give him the house, he will make sure everyone knows what kind of person I really am. The strange part is that I almost gave it to him. Until I found an envelope hidden inside my mother's old sewing cabinet. But before I explain what was inside that envelope, I need to explain why that house mattered so much to all of us. My parents bought it when I was 9 years old. It wasn't anything special. 2 floors, 3 bedrooms, an old kitchen with yellow cabinets, and a narrow backyard where my father grew tomatoes every summer. But every important memory of my childhood happened there. My mother used to sit by the front window every evening, waiting for my father to come home from work. My brother Daniel and I shared the upstairs bedroom until I was 16. We fought constantly. He would steal my headphones. I would hide his shoes. Normal sibling stuff. But there was one difference between us that became more obvious as we grew older. I stayed. Daniel left. When he turned 19, he moved to another city and barely came home. He got married, started a business, and built a life of his own. I stayed close to my parents. When my father became sick, I drove him to appointments. When my mother started having trouble with the stairs, I installed a railing. When the boiler broke in the middle of winter, I paid for the repair. I never complained about any of it. They were my parents. Then, 3 years ago, my father died. After the funeral, my mother became a completely different person. She was still kind, but quieter. She stopped going out. She stopped cooking. Sometimes I would visit and find her sitting in the living room with the television on, not even watching it. I began spending more time at the house. Eventually, I moved into the downstairs room. My mother never asked me to. I just knew she needed someone there. Daniel visited maybe once every 2 or 3 months. Whenever he came, he would hug Mom, bring her flowers, and talk about how busy his life was. I never resented him for that. At least, I didn't think I did. Then one evening, about 6 months before my mother died, she asked me something strange. We were sitting at the kitchen table. She had been staring at her tea for several minutes. Then she said, "If something happens to me, promise me you won't let Daniel take this house." I laughed because I thought she was joking. I said, "Mom, why would Daniel want the house?" She looked directly at me. "He doesn't want the house," she said. "He wants something inside it." I remember getting chills when she said that. I asked her what she meant. She wouldn't tell me. Instead, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Just promise me." So I did. I promised. I didn't ask another question. At the time, I assumed she was confused. She was getting older, and there were days when she mixed up dates or forgot conversations. But 2 weeks later, she called me into her bedroom and gave me a small brass key. She said, "When the time comes, you'll know where to use it." I asked her what it opened. She smiled sadly. "Something your brother has been looking for." That was the last real conversation we ever had about Daniel. 6 months later, my mother died peacefully in her sleep. And 3 days after the funeral, Daniel asked me the first question that would eventually destroy our relationship. "Did Mom leave you the house?" I told him yes. He stared at me for several seconds. Then he said something I will never forget. "She promised it to me." I thought he was grieving. I thought maybe he had misunderstood something. So I didn't argue. But Daniel wasn't finished. He leaned toward me and said, "Then you better check what she left behind before you decide the house is yours." At the time, I had no idea what he meant. Now I understand. And I wish I had never found that brass key. Because what it opened changed everything I believed about my family. The morning after Daniel told me to check what Mom left behind, I couldn't stop thinking about his words. For the first time, I began wondering whether my mother had actually left something important in the house. Not money. Not jewelry. Something else. I went through her bedroom first. Her closet was exactly how she'd left it. Cardigans hanging neatly on wooden hangers. Shoes lined up underneath. A small bottle of lavender perfume on the dresser. I found her jewelry box, old photographs, insurance papers, and several handwritten recipes. Nothing seemed unusual. Then I remembered the brass key. I had kept it in my wallet since Mom gave it to me. I took it out and stared at it. There was a tiny number engraved on one side. 17. I had no idea what it meant. That afternoon, I walked around the house looking for a lock that might fit it. Nothing. Every drawer opened normally. Every cabinet was unlocked. The basement had an old storage closet, but its padlock was much larger than the key. I was about to give up when I noticed something in my mother's sewing room. A cabinet. It was an old wooden sewing cabinet that had belonged to my grandmother. I had seen it my entire life, but I had never really paid attention to it. There were 3 drawers on the left and a larger compartment underneath. I tried the brass key in the first drawer. Nothing. Second drawer. Nothing. Third drawer. Nothing. Then I noticed a tiny keyhole underneath the bottom drawer. I inserted the key. It turned immediately. My heart started beating faster. The drawer didn't open. Instead, I heard a faint click behind the cabinet. I stepped back. For a few seconds, I just stared at it. Then I pushed the cabinet away from the wall. Behind it was a narrow wooden panel. I almost laughed. It looked like something from an old mystery movie. There was another keyhole. The brass key fit perfectly. The panel opened inward. Behind it was a shallow compartment built into the wall. Inside was a small metal box. And on top of the box was a handwritten note. My mother's handwriting. It said, "For Michael. Read this alone." I sat down on the floor. My hands were shaking. I opened the box. Inside were several documents, an old photograph, a bank statement, and 3 sealed envelopes. The first envelope had my name on it. The second had Daniel's name. The third simply said, "After you understand everything." I opened mine first. The letter was only 2 pages long. My mother explained that years earlier, she and my father had discovered something about Daniel. Something they had kept secret from me. According to the letter, Daniel had been involved in a financial arrangement with my father. My father had given Daniel a large amount of money to start his business. But Daniel had told everyone that he had built the business himself. That alone didn't shock me. What shocked me was the next sentence. My mother wrote that the money had not come from my father's savings. It had come from a loan secured against the family house. I read that sentence 3 times. My father had apparently borrowed against the house without telling me. And Daniel had never paid the money back. I immediately thought about the mortgage documents. I knew my parents had refinanced the house years earlier. But I had always assumed it was for medical expenses. My mother explained that my father had initially intended to tell me. But Daniel begged him not to. Then Daniel promised he would repay everything within 5 years. He didn't. Instead, he bought a new car. Then he expanded his business. Then he bought another property. Meanwhile, my parents continued making payments on the loan. I couldn't breathe. My brother had been building his life using the value of my parents' home. But there was something even worse. My mother wrote that she had confronted Daniel about it 2 years before my father's death. He became furious. He told her that the money was his. He said Dad had promised him the house eventually anyway. My mother disagreed. She told him the house would go to me because I had been the one caring for them. That was apparently when Daniel changed his attitude. He started visiting more often. He became unusually friendly with my mother. And according to her letter, he began asking questions about where she kept important documents. I stopped reading. I stared at the wall. Suddenly, Daniel's behavior after the funeral made sense. He hadn't asked whether Mom was okay. He hadn't asked how I was doing. His first question had been about the house. I opened the second document. It was a bank statement. The outstanding loan was much larger than I expected. But there was another document underneath it. A legal agreement. I read the first paragraph. Then I felt my stomach drop. The house wasn't completely free and clear. And according to the agreement, if the loan wasn't settled, someone else could make a claim against it. Someone whose name I recognized immediately. Daniel. I thought that was the worst part. It wasn't. Because underneath the legal agreement was one final page. A page my mother had apparently added only a few weeks before she died. And at the bottom she had written, "Michael, if Daniel tells you he deserves the house, ask him why he signed this." I looked at the signature. It belonged to my brother. And suddenly I realized my mother hadn't left me the house because she trusted me more than Daniel. She had left it to me because she knew Daniel was hiding something. Something he had personally signed. Something that could completely change who actually owned the house. I reached for the third envelope. The one that said, "After you understand everything." And for the first time since my mother died, I was genuinely afraid of what I might find. I didn't open the third envelope immediately. I just sat there on the floor of my mother's sewing room, staring at it. For some reason, I felt like opening that envelope would cross a line. Up until that moment, I had still been able to tell myself that maybe there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe Daniel had signed something years ago and forgotten about it. Maybe my mother had misunderstood the situation. Maybe my father had made some complicated financial arrangement that I didn't know about. But deep down, I already knew I was trying to find excuses for my brother. So I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a letter. It was a copy of a signed agreement. At the top was Daniel's full name. Underneath it was the address of our family home. And then I saw the sentence my mother wanted me to see. Daniel had signed an agreement acknowledging that the money my father gave him was a loan, not a gift. The agreement stated that he would repay the amount within 5 years. If he failed to do so, he would have no ownership claim over the family property. I read it again. Then again. There was no confusion. Daniel knew. He had always known. He had borrowed the money. He had agreed to repay it. And he had failed. But there was another page. It showed a list of payments. Daniel had made exactly 2 payments. Then nothing. For nearly 7 years. I felt angry. But underneath the anger was something worse. I felt betrayed. Not because of the money. Because my father had apparently trusted Daniel enough to put the house at risk. And my mother had spent years trying to protect it. I looked through the remaining papers. There were copies of emails between my mother and Daniel. Most of them were from the last year of her life. The emails became increasingly hostile. My mother had repeatedly asked Daniel to settle the debt. Daniel kept saying he was working on it. Then one email caught my attention. It was from Daniel to Mom. The subject line said, "You can't do this to me." The message was short. Daniel wrote that he deserved the house because he was their son too. He accused my mother of favoring me. He said that I had manipulated her into leaving everything to me. Then he wrote something that made my hands go cold. "If you change the will, you know what happens next." I stopped breathing for a moment. It sounded like a threat. But before I could jump to conclusions, I noticed my mother's handwritten note beside the email. She had written, "This is why I stopped telling Michael everything." I kept reading. Apparently, my mother was afraid Daniel would cause a family fight while she was still alive. She didn't want her final years filled with arguments. So she decided to wait. She hired a lawyer. She updated her will. And she placed everything she wanted me to know inside the hidden compartment. But then I found something that completely changed my understanding of the situation. A medical document. It was related to my father. I knew he had been sick before he died. But this document revealed something I had never been told. My father had discovered Daniel's unpaid debt shortly before his final hospitalization. And apparently, he had confronted Daniel about it. According to my mother's notes, the argument had been terrible. My father told Daniel that if he didn't repay the money, he would remove him from the will. Daniel apparently responded that Dad couldn't do that because he was too sick to understand what he was doing. I sat there for several minutes. My father had been dying. My brother knew it. And instead of worrying about him, Daniel was worried about inheritance. I wanted to call Daniel immediately. But then I remembered my mother's warning. Before you confront him, understand everything. So I kept searching. At the very bottom of the box, underneath the legal documents, was an old photograph. It showed my father, Daniel, and another man standing outside a bank. I recognized the bank. It was the same bank listed on the loan documents. But I didn't recognize the other man. I turned the photograph over. There was a date written on the back. 7 years earlier. And underneath the date, my mother had written, "This is the day Daniel lied to both of us." I stared at that sentence. What had he lied about? I looked at the photograph again. The man standing beside my father wasn't a banker. He was someone I knew. Someone I had seen at family gatherings. Someone Daniel had introduced to us as his business partner. And suddenly I remembered something. That man had disappeared from Daniel's life shortly after the business became successful. I had never asked why. Now I knew I needed to find him. I spent the next hour searching through my old contacts. I finally found his number. His name was Graham. I called. He answered on the fourth ring. I said, "Graham, this is Michael. I need to ask you about Daniel." There was a long silence. Then Graham said something I wasn't prepared to hear. "Michael, your brother told me your parents were dead to him years before your father actually died." I asked what he meant. Graham sighed. Then he said, "Your brother didn't borrow that money to start his business." I froze. What did he use it for? Graham was quiet again. Then he answered. He used it to pay someone to keep a secret. And suddenly the entire story became much bigger than a house. For several seconds after Graham said that, I couldn't speak. I had expected him to tell me Daniel had used the money for something irresponsible. A failed investment. A bad business deal. Maybe gambling. Something I could understand. But paying someone to keep a secret? That was different. I asked Graham, what secret? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked me where I was. I told him I was at my mother's house. He said, "Don't talk about this over the phone." Then he gave me an address. It was a small cafe about 20 minutes from my house. I almost didn't go. Part of me thought I was getting dragged into something that wasn't my business. My mother was gone. My father was gone. Daniel was my only remaining sibling. Maybe I should simply accept the house, settle whatever debt existed, and move on. But then I remembered my mother's final words. Understand everything. So I went. Graham was sitting in the back corner of the cafe. He looked older than I remembered. We hadn't seen each other in years. He stood when I approached and shook my hand. Then he said, "Your brother is going to tell you I'm lying." I told him I hadn't even spoken to Daniel yet. Graham smiled sadly. "He'll still say it." I sat down. He took a folded piece of paper from his jacket. Before handing it to me, he said, "I kept this because I knew one day you'd need it." It was a photocopy of a bank transfer. The amount was almost exactly the same as the loan my father had taken against the house. The recipient wasn't Daniel's company. It wasn't a supplier. It wasn't a bank. It was an individual. A woman named Claire Morrison. I didn't recognize the name. I asked Graham who she was. He looked at me for a long moment. "She worked for your father." That didn't make sense. My father had been retired by then. Graham explained that Claire had worked in my father's company many years earlier. She had been responsible for financial records. Apparently, she had discovered something about Daniel. Something that could have destroyed his business before it even began. I asked what. Graham leaned closer. Daniel had been falsifying some of his business records. I felt my stomach tighten. Before the business even opened. He nodded. He was trying to convince investors that he had more money and more clients than he actually did. I asked what Claire had done. She found out. Apparently, Claire had threatened to report him. Daniel panicked. He went to my father. My father was furious. But instead of immediately cutting Daniel off, he tried to protect him. That was the part one couldn't understand. Why would my father put the family home at risk for something like that? Graham explained that my father believed Daniel had made one terrible mistake. He thought he could fix it. So my father borrowed against the house and gave Daniel the money. Daniel used part of it to pay Claire for her silence. The rest went into his business. I sat there staring at the table. My entire childhood home had been used as collateral for my brother's secret. But Graham wasn't finished. He said, there was another person who knew. Who? Your mother. That part one already knew. But then he added. She wasn't angry because Daniel lied about the business. I looked up. Then why? Graham hesitated. Because Claire wasn't the only person Daniel paid. My heart started pounding. What do you mean? Graham said that shortly after the first payment, Daniel gave another large amount of money to someone else. Someone in the family. I immediately thought of my father. But Graham shook his head. Not your father. I asked who. He wouldn't say. Instead, he pulled out another document. This one was a handwritten receipt. The handwriting looked familiar. Very familiar. I stared at it. Then I realized why. It was my mother's handwriting. I couldn't understand what I was looking at. The receipt said that my mother had received a payment from Daniel. The amount was significant. And underneath it, she had written. Received in exchange for my agreement not to disclose what happened. My hands went numb. For the first time, I wondered if my mother had been hiding something from me too. I asked Graham, what happened? He looked at me and said. That's the question your mother wanted you to ask. I went home that evening and called Daniel. He answered immediately. Did you find something? I didn't tell him what I knew. I simply asked, why did Mom take money from you? There was silence. Not surprise. Not confusion. Silence. Then Daniel said quietly. So she finally told you. Those 5 words changed everything. He knew. He knew about the hidden compartment. He knew about the documents. And he knew exactly what my mother had been protecting. I asked him what the money was for. He said, you don't want to know. I told him I already knew about the loan. He became defensive. Then angry. He accused me of going through Mom's private things. I reminded him that she had left the documents specifically for me. He said, you think you understand what happened because you found a few pieces of paper. I said, then explain it. He didn't. Instead, he said something that made me question everything again. Michael, Mom didn't leave you the house because she loved you more. I said nothing. He continued. She left it to you because she knew you would never ask the one question that matters. What question? Daniel took a breath. Then he said. Ask Mom why she was the one who started the whole thing. The call ended. I stood alone in the kitchen. And suddenly, the story I had believed for years that Daniel was the selfish brother and my mother was the innocent victim started falling apart. Because maybe my mother hadn't just been protecting me from Daniel. Maybe she had been protecting me from the truth about herself. I didn't sleep that night. Daniel's final sentence kept repeating in my head. Ask Mom why she was the one who started the whole thing. But my mother was gone. There was no way to ask her. The only person who could explain what happened was Daniel, and after our conversation, I didn't trust him enough to believe anything he said. So I went back to the documents. I spread everything across the dining table. The loan agreement. The bank transfers. The receipt in my mother's handwriting. The photograph of my father and Daniel outside the bank. And the letter my mother had written to me. For almost 2 hours, I tried to put the pieces together. Then I noticed something I had missed. The date on my mother's receipt was 3 months before my father borrowed the money against the house. That didn't make sense. If Daniel had borrowed the money from my father later, why had my mother already received money from him? I checked the amount. It was smaller than the loan, but still significant. Then I noticed the description she had written. It didn't say loan. It said repayment. I stared at the word. Repayment. What had Daniel been repaying her for? I called Graham. He answered almost immediately. I asked him about the receipt. There was silence. Then he said, I was hoping you wouldn't find that. I asked what it meant. Graham finally told me something he had never told my father. Years before Daniel started his business, he had gotten into serious financial trouble. Not because of the business. Because of a personal debt. Daniel had borrowed money from several people and couldn't pay it back. My mother discovered what was happening. She secretly paid some of those debts. She didn't tell my father. She didn't tell me. And Daniel promised her he would repay every penny. He didn't. Instead, he asked for more. That's when my mother made a terrible decision. She told Daniel that if he wanted another chance, he had to involve my father. She convinced my father that Daniel had a legitimate business opportunity. She told him the money would help him become independent. My father trusted her. He borrowed against the house. And Daniel received the money. I sat back in my chair. Suddenly, the story made sense. My mother had started it. Not because she wanted to hurt anyone. She was trying to protect Daniel. She believed she could rescue her younger son from his mistakes. Instead, she had created a problem that lasted for years. I called Graham again. Why didn't you tell my father? He said, I tried. What happened? Your mother stopped me. That hurt more than I expected. My mother had protected Daniel so many times that she had eventually put the entire family at risk. But there was still one thing I couldn't understand. Why had she eventually left the house to me? Graham said, because she realized she had made a mistake. Then he told me about a conversation he had with my mother shortly before she died. She had apparently told him she was afraid Daniel would come after the house. She knew Daniel had never repaid the loan. She knew he believed the house should eventually become his. And she knew something else. Daniel had discovered that the loan documents were incomplete. There was a legal technicality that might allow him to challenge the ownership of the house. That explained why he was so confident. He wasn't simply demanding the house. He thought he had a legal argument. I asked Graham if he knew what the technicality was. He said he didn't. But he gave me the name of the lawyer who had helped my mother update her will. I called the lawyer the next morning. Her name was Margaret Ellis. I explained who I was. There was a long pause after I mentioned my mother's name. Then Margaret said, I've been expecting your call. I asked what she meant. She said my mother had left very specific instructions. She wasn't allowed to discuss certain matters with me until after the funeral. But now she could. I drove to her office that afternoon. Margaret placed a thick folder on the desk. This is everything your mother wanted you to have. I opened it. The first pages were copies of the updated will. Then came property records. Then loan documents. And finally, something I had never seen before. A statement signed by Daniel. I read it carefully. Daniel acknowledged that he had received money from my father. He acknowledged that the money was secured against the house. And then came the sentence that made my hands shake. He agreed that if the debt wasn't repaid, he would have no claim to the property. I looked at Margaret. Then why is he threatening me? She gave me a strange look. Because that's not the document he's using. I frowned. What other document? She opened another folder. Inside was a second agreement. This one had been signed several months later. And unlike the first document, it appeared to give Daniel an interest in the house. I stared at the signature. It looked like my father's. But Margaret shook her head. That's why your mother hired me. I looked at her. She lowered her voice. Your mother believed this signature was forged. My heart stopped. If she was right, then Daniel hadn't simply failed to repay a loan. He had created a document claiming part of my parents' home. And now he was using that document to demand ownership. But Margaret wasn't finished. She slid one final page across the desk. This is why your mother told me never to show you until after she died. I looked down. It was a handwriting analysis. The conclusion was clear. The signature on Daniel's document did not match my father's genuine signature. But there was another detail. The expert had found something else. The document had been created after my father was already in the hospital. And the person who submitted it to the bank had used Daniel's identification. I looked up at Margaret. So Daniel forged it? She didn't answer directly. Instead, she said. Michael, there is one more person involved. My stomach tightened. Who? Margaret looked at me. Then she said a name I never expected to hear. Your mother. For a moment, I honestly thought I had misunderstood Margaret. I said, my mother. She nodded. But she didn't forge my father's signature, I said. No, Margaret replied. She didn't. I waited. Margaret opened another file and pulled out a handwritten statement from my mother. She placed it in front of me. I recognized the handwriting immediately. The first sentence said, I helped Daniel create the document. I felt like the room had suddenly become too small. I read the statement slowly. My mother explained that Daniel had come to her after my father became seriously ill. He told her he was afraid Dad would die before the debt was settled. He said his business would collapse if the bank demanded repayment. He begged her to help him. My mother refused at first. Then Daniel told her something that frightened her. He said that if the bank called in the loan, the house could be sold. My mother panicked. She had spent decades in that house. It wasn't just property to her. It was the place where she had raised us. So she made another terrible decision. She agreed to help Daniel prepare paperwork that would temporarily protect the house from the bank. According to her statement, she believed the document would only be used as evidence that Daniel had a future interest in the property. She never intended it to become a permanent ownership claim. But Daniel apparently had other plans. He submitted the document without telling her. And once it was registered, he started telling people that my father had promised him part of the house. My mother realized what he had done. She confronted him. Daniel denied everything. Then he reminded her that she had helped create the document. That meant if she exposed him, she could also be implicated. My mother was trapped. I put the paper down. I was angry at Daniel. But I was also angry at my mother. She had spent years making decisions behind everyone's backs. She had protected Daniel. She had hidden the loan. She had helped him with the questionable document. And now she had left me to clean up the mess. I asked Margaret why my mother hadn't simply told me everything while she was alive. Margaret said, because she was ashamed. That answer hurt. My mother had always been the person I trusted most. I couldn't understand why she hadn't trusted me enough to tell me the truth. Margaret looked at me and said something I'll never forget. Your mother wasn't afraid you would hate her. She was afraid you would forgive her. I didn't understand. Margaret explained. My mother believed that if she told me everything, I would try to fix the situation myself. She knew I had always taken responsibility for everyone. She didn't want me to spend the rest of my life cleaning up her mistakes. So she decided to leave the evidence instead. She wanted me to make my own decision. I left Margaret's office with copies of everything. On the drive home, I kept thinking about Daniel. I wondered what he would do when he realized I knew. I didn't have to wait long. That evening, he showed up at the house. He didn't call. He simply knocked on the door. When I opened it, he looked completely calm. That somehow made me more nervous. He said, "We need to talk." I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. He looked at the house. Then he said, "Mom wanted you to have this place." I know that. I didn't respond. But Dad promised me part of it. I said, Dad's signature was forged. Daniel's expression changed. Only for a second. Then he recovered. You don't know that. I have the handwriting analysis. He stared at me. Then he asked, "Who gave you that?" I said, "Mom's lawyer." Daniel laughed. Not because anything was funny. It was the kind of laugh someone gives when they realize an argument isn't going their way. He said, "So Mom finally made you choose." I asked him what he meant. He looked at me and said, "She always chose me." I told him that wasn't true. He became angry. He said I had no idea what our parents had done for him. I told him I knew about the loan. I knew about Claire. I knew about the forged document. And I knew Mom had helped him. Daniel went completely silent. Then he asked, "Did she tell you about the money?" I said, "What money?" He looked away. For the first time, he seemed genuinely frightened. He said, "Forget I asked." I grabbed his arm before he could walk away. What money? He pulled away. Then he said, Mom didn't pay my debts. I stared at him. She paid yours. He nodded. That's what everyone thinks. Then he looked directly at me. But that's not what happened. I asked him what he meant. He took a deep breath. Then he said, the money Mom gave me wasn't for my debts. I waited. He whispered. It was to keep Dad from finding out who really owed the money. I felt a cold wave move through me. Who? Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he said, Michael, you keep thinking this whole thing is about me. He pointed toward the house. It isn't. Then he said something that made me question my entire childhood. The debt belonged to someone else in this family. I stood there staring at Daniel. The debt belonged to someone else in this family. Those words didn't make sense. I asked him to explain. He shook his head. Not here. I told him that after everything he'd hidden from me, he didn't get to decide where we talked. He looked toward the house. Then he said quietly, you really don't remember? Remember what? He looked almost disappointed. Dad's first business. I froze. My father had owned a small repair company before he retired. It had struggled during the final years. I remembered the arguments about money. I remembered my parents worrying about bills. But I had never known there was a major debt. Daniel said, Dad didn't close the business because he wanted to retire. I stared at him. He closed it because someone had been taking money from it. Who? Daniel looked at me. You. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny. Because the accusation was so absurd. I was 19 when my father's business closed. I was working part-time at a grocery store. I didn't even have access to the company accounts. Daniel said, you didn't take the money. Then why did you say me? Because Dad thought you did. I couldn't speak. Daniel explained that several years before the business closed, money had disappeared from one of the company accounts. My father initially believed it was an accounting error. Then he discovered that payments had been made using my name. There were receipts. Transfers. Invoices. Everything appeared to point toward me. But I had never seen any of it. My father confronted me. I told him I knew nothing. He didn't believe me. That argument had been one of the reasons I eventually moved out for a while. I had always thought Dad was simply angry because the business was failing. Daniel said that wasn't the real reason. He thought you were stealing from him. I felt sick. Then who was? Daniel looked down. I was. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He said he had taken the money when he was younger. He had been gambling with friends and had gotten into debt. He used money from Dad's business to cover it. When the missing money was discovered, Daniel panicked. He created records that made it appear I had taken it. My father believed the evidence. My mother eventually discovered the truth. But by then, the damage had already been done. My father had closed the business. He had borrowed money to cover the remaining debts. And the family had spent years believing I had somehow contributed to the collapse. I remembered all those years. The strange distance from my father. The way he sometimes looked at me with disappointment. The conversations that suddenly stopped whenever I entered a room. I had spent decades wondering what I had done wrong. Now I knew. I looked at Daniel. Why didn't you tell me? He said, I was scared. You let Dad think I stole from him for 20 years. I know. You let Mom carry this secret. I know. You used the house to fix your own mistakes. I know. I expected him to defend himself. Instead, he just stood there. Then he said. But there's one thing you still don't know. I was exhausted. I told him to leave. He refused. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an old envelope. He handed it to me. The envelope was addressed to my father. The date was from 22 years ago. I recognized the handwriting. It was Daniel's. I opened it. Inside was a confession. Daniel had written everything down. He admitted taking the money. He admitted creating false records. And he admitted making it look like I was responsible. But the letter had never been sent. At the bottom, there was another handwritten note. My mother's handwriting. It said, "I couldn't let your father see this." I looked at Daniel. "You gave this to Mom?" He nodded. "Why?" "Because I was going to confess." I asked him why he didn't. He said something I will never forget. "Mom told me Dad wouldn't survive the truth." I wanted to be furious with my mother. But suddenly, I understood why she had spent so many years protecting Daniel. She wasn't protecting his reputation anymore. She was protecting my father from a devastating truth while he was already struggling. But then Daniel said, "That was the original secret." I looked at him. "What do you mean?" He said the house wasn't supposed to be involved. The loan against the house happened years later. And according to Daniel, it wasn't his idea. I asked him who came up with it. He hesitated. Then he said, "Mom." I felt my stomach drop. "She told Dad you had been responsible for the missing money," Daniel said. "She convinced him that helping me start over would somehow repair the damage." I couldn't believe it. My mother had protected Daniel by allowing my father to continue believing I was guilty. And then she had used the family home to give Daniel another chance. I sat down on the front steps. For the first time, I wasn't angry. I was simply tired. Daniel sat beside me. After several minutes, he said, "I don't actually want the house." I turned toward him. "What?" He looked at me. "I never wanted the house." "Then why have you been fighting me for it?" "Because I thought it was the only way to make things right." I didn't understand. He explained that the house had been used as security for the money that had originally been taken from Dad's business. He believed that if he could somehow get ownership of the house, he could sell it, repay what remained, and finally admit everything. But I asked him the obvious question. "Why didn't you just tell me?" He looked down. "Because I knew you'd hate me." Then he gave me one final piece of information. There was still one person who had the original financial records from my father's business. The records that could prove I had never stolen anything. And that person wasn't Graham. It wasn't Margaret. It wasn't Daniel. It was someone my mother had trusted for more than 30 years. Daniel gave me her name. Evelyn Carter. And when I heard that name, I remembered something. Evelyn had been at my father's funeral. She had stood beside my mother. And before leaving, she had hugged me and whispered, "Your mother wanted you to know the truth. She just didn't know how to tell you." The next morning, I went to Evelyn's house. I thought I was finally going to get the answer I'd been searching for. Instead, she opened the door holding a box. And before I could say a word, she told me, "Michael, your mother wasn't the only person who lied to you." I stood at Evelyn's front door, unable to say anything. She was holding an old cardboard box against her chest. I asked her what she meant. She looked past me toward the street, as if checking whether someone had followed me. Then she said, "Come inside." Her house smelled like old books and coffee. She placed the box on the dining table and slowly opened it. Inside were folders, receipts, handwritten notes, and several old computer printouts. "These are your father's original business records," she said. I picked up the first folder. My name was nowhere on the pages. Daniel's name was. I kept turning pages. There were payments Daniel had made. Money he had taken. Accounts he had opened. And records showing that someone had altered several invoices to make it appear that I had authorized them. My hands started shaking. For 20 years, I had carried the belief that my father had died thinking I had betrayed him. Now I had proof that I hadn't. I asked Evelyn why she had kept these records. She said, "Your mother asked me to." I looked up. She knew. Evelyn nodded. She found out the truth years ago. Then why didn't she tell Dad? Evelyn looked down. Because by the time she knew everything, your father was already sick. I asked what that had to do with the house. She took out another folder. Inside was a letter from my mother. It explained the final piece of the story. My mother had discovered that Daniel had not simply stolen from the business. He had borrowed money from people outside the family. Some of those people had threatened to take legal action against him. My mother panicked. She believed that if Daniel lost everything, he would end up in serious trouble. So she used the family home as collateral. She convinced my father to help Daniel. My father agreed because he still believed Daniel had made one terrible mistake that could be corrected. Neither of them knew the full truth. My mother knew. Daniel knew. And Evelyn knew. I was the only one left outside the circle. I felt something inside me break. Not because Daniel had done terrible things. I already knew that. It was because my mother had spent years protecting him while allowing me to believe my father had died disappointed in me. I asked Evelyn why she hadn't told me after my father's death. She said my mother made her promise. She told me that if she told you too early, you'd spend your life trying to fix everything. I laughed bitterly. She was right. Evelyn smiled sadly. She knew you. Then she handed me one final document. It was a letter from my father. I recognized his handwriting. The letter was dated only a few weeks before he died. I opened it. The first line made me stop breathing. Michael, if you're reading this, then your mother finally told you enough. I read every word. My father admitted that he had suspected for years that I hadn't taken the money. He had eventually discovered evidence pointing toward Daniel. But he was too ashamed to admit that he had blamed the wrong son. He wrote that he had wanted to apologize. He simply didn't know how. Then he wrote something that completely changed how I remembered my final conversation with him. I had visited him in the hospital 2 days before he died. He had been very weak. Before I left, he grabbed my hand. He tried to say something. I thought he was asking me to take care of Mom. But according to the letter, he had actually been trying to say, "I'm sorry. I had misunderstood him." I sat at Evelyn's table and cried. Not because my father had made a mistake. Because I finally knew he had regretted it. For the first time in 20 years, I felt free from something I hadn't even realized I was carrying. But there was still the house. I asked Evelyn what I should do. She said, "That's your decision." I went home and called Daniel. I told him I had the original records. He was silent. Then he said, "I'm sorry." It was the first time he'd ever said those words without making an excuse afterward. I asked him why he had waited so long. He said he was afraid. I told him that fear had cost our family decades. He agreed. Then I asked him what he actually wanted. He said, "I want to tell the truth." That surprised me. I asked him if he was willing to sign a statement admitting everything. He said yes. We met the next day at Margaret's office. Daniel signed documents acknowledging the original debt. He admitted that the ownership document had been improperly created. He admitted that he had taken money from the family business years ago. And most importantly, he signed a statement clearing my name. I thought that would be the end. It wasn't. Because Margaret then told us something neither of us expected. The bank had reviewed the records. The remaining debt was much smaller than we thought. My mother had secretly been paying it for years. She had almost finished paying it off. She had been planning to clear the final amount before she died. But she hadn't managed to. So Daniel and I agreed to pay the remaining balance together. Not because we were suddenly close. Not because everything was forgiven. But because it was the right thing to do. A few weeks later, the house was officially mine. Daniel didn't ask for it again. Instead, he asked if he could come inside. I said yes. We walked through the rooms together. For the first time in years, neither of us argued. We stood in the kitchen where Mom used to make breakfast. Daniel looked around and said, "She really loved this place." I said, "She did." Then he looked at me. "She loved us too." I nodded. Even after everything, I believed that was true. My mother made terrible choices. Daniel made worse ones. My father made mistakes. And I spent years believing I was responsible for something I never did. But I finally understood something. Sometimes families don't fall apart because people stop loving each other. Sometimes they fall apart because people love each other so badly that they start hiding the truth. I kept the house. Not because I wanted to win. Not because Daniel didn't deserve anything. I kept it because it was the last place where my parents had built a life together. And because, after 20 years of carrying someone else's mistake, I finally deserved to stop apologizing for it. As for Daniel, we're not close. Maybe we never will be. But we speak occasionally. And every year, on the anniversary of our father's death, he comes to the house. We sit on the back porch. We talk about Dad. We talk about Mom. And we don't pretend the past didn't happen. Because that's the only way we've found to move forward. So, Reddit, after everything that happened, I still wonder about one thing. AITA for keeping the family house instead of giving it to my brother. I thought the story ended when Daniel signed the papers. I thought the house was mine, the debt was settled, my name had been cleared, and whatever remained of my relationship with my brother could simply become something I accepted. For a while, that's exactly what happened. Then, almost 4 months later, I received a letter. It wasn't from Daniel. It wasn't from Margaret. It wasn't from the bank. It was from a woman named Claire Morrison. The same Claire whose name had appeared in the original documents. She wrote that she had heard my mother had passed away. She said there was something she had wanted to tell my mother before she died but never had the courage. She asked me to meet her. I almost threw the letter away. I was tired of secrets. Tired of documents. Tired of discovering that every answer created 3 more questions. But one sentence made me change my mind. Claire had written. Your mother never paid me to keep Daniel's secret. That sentence stayed in my head all night. The next afternoon, I met her at a small cafe. She was older than I expected. She looked nervous when I sat down. I asked her what she meant. She told me the money Daniel had given her years ago wasn't payment for silence. It was repayment. She had lent Daniel money before his business started. When he couldn't repay her, my mother eventually stepped in. That was the secret everyone had misunderstood. But Claire had something else. She had kept an old letter from my father. A letter he had written to her after discovering Daniel's deception. I read it carefully. My father knew Daniel had stolen from the business. He knew I had been blamed. And he had started investigating. But before he could confront Daniel publicly, he became seriously ill. Then my mother intervened. She convinced him to let the matter go. Not because she thought Daniel deserved protection. Because she believed Daniel was finally willing to change. My father agreed. But he made one condition. Daniel had to repay everything. He never did. Claire looked at me and said, your father wanted to tell you the truth before he died. I asked why he hadn't. She said, because your mother asked him for more time. That sentence hurt. More time. My mother had spent years believing she could fix Daniel. And while she was trying to fix him, she had unknowingly damaged me. I went home that evening and sat in the living room for hours. I looked around the house. For years, I had thought this place represented my parents' love. Now I realized it also represented every secret they had buried. I called Daniel. I told him about Claire. He was quiet. Then he said. I knew she still had that letter. I asked why he never told me. He said, because I was ashamed. I told him that wasn't an excuse anymore. He agreed. Then he said something I didn't expect. Michael, I think we should sell the house. I laughed. You spent years trying to get the house. I know. Now you want to sell it? No. He paused. I think Mom would have wanted us to stop fighting over it. That was the first time I considered it. Not because I wanted money. Not because I wanted to punish him. But because maybe the house had become a symbol of everything that had gone wrong between us. So we made a decision. We wouldn't sell it immediately. We would keep it for 1 year. 1 year without lawyers. 1 year without arguments about inheritance. 1 year where neither of us would use the house as leverage against the other. And then we'd decide. That year changed something between us. Daniel started visiting more often. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we sat in silence. Once, he brought an old photograph album. We spent an entire afternoon looking through pictures from when we were children. There was one picture of Daniel and me sitting beside our father. We were both about 10 years old. My father had his arms around us. I stared at the photograph for a long time. Then Daniel said quietly. I remember that day. I asked what he remembered. He said Dad had told us something. What? Daniel smiled sadly. He said, "You two are going to have each other long after I'm gone." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then Daniel said, "I think we spent 20 years proving him wrong." I couldn't help laughing. It was the first time we had laughed together in years. Eventually, we decided not to sell the house. Instead, we repaired it. The old kitchen was renovated. The roof was replaced. My mother's sewing room stayed exactly the same. I even kept the hidden compartment behind the cabinet. Not because I wanted to preserve the secrets. Because I wanted to remember what those secrets had taught me. A few months later, Daniel gave me something. It was the brass key my mother had originally given me. I had forgotten that he had taken it during one of our earlier arguments. He put it on the table. "I don't want this," he said. I asked why. He said, "Because it was never really about opening a door." He looked at me. It was about finally opening the truth. I kept the key. And I still have it. I also still have my mother's letter. I don't know whether keeping the house was the right decision. I don't know whether Daniel deserved part of it. Maybe someone reading this would say I should have sold it and split everything equally. Maybe someone else would say Daniel should have received nothing. I understand both sides now. Because after everything, I don't think the house was ever really the problem. The problem was that my family spent decades believing that protecting someone from the consequences of their choices was the same thing as loving them. It wasn't. Sometimes love means telling someone the truth even when the truth hurts. Sometimes forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. And sometimes keeping something isn't about being selfish. Sometimes it's about finally refusing to carry someone else's guilt. So that's where things stand today. Daniel and I aren't best friends. We probably never will be. But we're brothers again. And for the first time in my life, I can walk through that house without wondering whether my father ever believed me. I know he did. I just wish he had told me sooner. Would you have kept the house or sold it and divided the money?